Thank you, Kristen. Hello, everyone. My name is Jasmine Noctegal-Fournier. I'm the co-founder and president of GovInvest. I started GovInvest back in 2014, and my focus at GovInvest is really making sure we're building and delivering the best solutions to our clients and ensuring that they have the best overall experience possible. So, John, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm John Kazor with Municipal Analytics. I have been working in local government consulting for about 27 years, compensation studies, feasibility studies, financial forecasting. So a lot of the things you heard in the previous presentation, if you're here for that, also resonate with the work that I've done in the past in terms of identifying strategies. So a base part of that is building out your benchmarking, and we will be talking about that today.
Awesome. Nitish?
Good morning, everyone. Nitish Sharma. I am the Senior Public Finance Consultant with GovInvest, and actually spent a lot of time in municipal government, special districts as a Chief Administrative Officer, Finance Director. And today I'm very excited to talk about the compensation model that I used in my prior agencies to help mitigate or create opportunities for the agencies that I worked in. So I've been in this business for over 20 years and very excited to be here and part of this panel.
Awesome. And some brief housekeeping items. We mentioned this in the previous presentation, but if you just joined us, we will be sending out a copy of this presentation after the conclusion of the webinar, and we will also be answering questions during the webinar, so you can use the Q&A function or the chat function to be able to ask some questions, and there will be some polling. So excited to get your kind of feedback as we go throughout this. In terms of a high-level agenda, we will be going through Compensation Benchmarking 101, some best practices, talking about some case studies for how we've done this kind of work in the past, what's worked well, what some of the challenges are, and then some of the new tools that we are building and helping our clients with to really make this a lot easier. So very excited to share that with you today.
So I'll get started then with the compensation benchmarking 101. For those of you that have gone through this process, you're probably a little bit familiar with this. It does vary place to place, time to time, but I wanted to just walk through the process of what it takes to actually develop the compensation benchmarking to determine what your market comparables are, and look at where you fall within your competitive market for wages and sometimes also benefits. So the first thing that you have to do, obviously, is define what it is you're looking at. And the critical components here are which classifications. I've worked with a lot of communities that are only looking at doing a benchmarking because they're heading into labor negotiations with a union, and they just want to make sure they've got the best data available. There are others that are proactive and want to look at the entire organization to make sure that they understand where they stand organizationally in the market. You might also consider doing this if you're creating a new service area and you need to establish what the pay rates should be. So there's lots of reasons why you do this, but defining which positions you're looking at is critical. Also, what are you going to include in your benchmarking? Is it just salaries and wages? Is it benefits as well, cash base, or the actual benefit offerings? If you're looking at wages and salaries, which is the most common thing, you've got to ask if you're going to be looking at incumbent pay, what are current people being paid, or if you're looking at ranges, the minimum, maximum for a particular classification, so that you can get that market data in a comprehensive form, and that might help you establish your own minimums and maximums as well. So there's reasons to look at this from a different perspectives. The one thing that I've seen lately is the market is really tight. So trying to make sure that you offer something that is competitive for the people that you are trying to attract and retain. As was noted in the last presentation, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. People are moving, whether they're retiring or moving on to other opportunities. You want to make sure you are competitive in whatever area that you are looking to be. I will also say that I'm only focusing right now on the compensation side of things. This is not looking at the comprehensive evaluation of comparing positions internally to establish internal equity. I'm just looking at the market comparability. So if we go to the next slide. Identifying the comparable agencies. So who are you going to compare yourself to is the next step. Sometimes you can say, well, we've been doing this for the last 20 years and we've always used the same 8 comparables and we're just going to keep using them. So that's one thing that I hear from my clients. Another option is to walk into negotiations and the community and the employer and the employee group offer their comparables, and you kind of negotiate what you're going to use for comparables. A third option is to say, we really don't know. So let's go out there and take a look and start gathering some metrics on who compares to us. What community, what other agencies look and feel like us, particularly in the same labor market. You don't want to be comparing yourself to a rural area if you're a large urban community, and similarly, if you're a small rural community, you don't want to be comparing yourself to a large urban area. So you're trying to make sure you got comparable look and feel in the community, as well as a similar scope of jobs that would be available in those 2 or 3 different areas that are key to your organization. The metrics that you might look at include things like your tax base, your unemployment rate, median household income, how far are you geographically, proximity. Are you in the same labor market? There are communities that might be on one side of the river from another, and they're in vastly different labor markets. So it's always important to make sure that you are looking at other benchmark communities that represent or reflect your own community. Also, you want to look at, sometimes there's information available from regional or statewide councils of governments, associations, whatnot, that gather information from annual salary surveys. I would caution that those often do not have the information that will best benefit you. They're very high-level surveys without a lot of data cleaning, and we'll talk about data cleaning later, but making sure that you have the positions that are comparable is important. So those surveys don't often include that unless it's a basic position. City clerks say that there might just be a unique position that everybody has. And then you've also got to look at whether you're comparing yourself only to other public agencies or if you also want to include private. And there's a case for including private for some classifications that might be clerical, legal staff, some skilled trades, people that or positions that move easily between the public and private sector with those skill sets. So you might want to determine that there are some positions that you do want to look at in the private sector as well as public, and making sure that you've got the right data set there. You can see here, there's just some examples of putting some metrics together for illustrating how comparable one community might be to another. And that can go a long way when you're actually trying to present this information at the end of the study to say, look, we did look at this and confirm that we are reasonably comparable to the other communities that we surveyed. Going on to the next slide. We've got to look at each position that is going to be included in the benchmarking study and make sure that they are actually well defined, so that when you are reaching out to your benchmarks, you actually know which position attributes you are looking at. There's a lot of uncertainty in today's world with job titles. I'm sure you've all seen that. It's really hard to know if a position labeled one thing in one community is actually similar to a position with a very similar name in another community, but they might have vastly different duties. So it's important to identify what those are, and that includes the supervisory control responsibilities, their education, and then whether or not the agency or that department or that position works regionally or is only a local provider. So if you have a public utility that only provides water, sewer, electric to the local municipality, that could be very different than a department that provides it to the local community as well as the 6 or 8 surrounding municipalities or a regional service provider that goes even further. It's going to be a vastly different scope of responsibilities there. So you're going to get different data on the market. So we want to make sure that you've got actually well-defined positions in terms of comparability there. And then also there's been a growing trend in the last 10, 15 years of combining positions. I've seen some very interesting combinations of positions. Just as an example here, there's a position of a assistant manager / finance director. This is a survey that we're working on right now. Can't find that position anywhere except in this one community. So we are starting to talk to other communities about, well, here's your finance position and here's your assistant manager and what are the differences between them. Again, what is the key attribute in those positions? And if in one community, the focus of the job that is assistant manager is really special projects or maybe labor negotiations / HR, that might be different than another community where that position is more focused on budget development and other things that might not necessarily be called finance director. But again, you've got to make sure those are comparable. Another one that I've seen is something like combining an engineer with the public works director position. Kent mentioned that in the last presentation about how they're having to combine more and more positions because they have so many vacancies. So there might be an example of a community where the person who's filling 2 roles gets the base pay, say in this instance for finance director, but they're also then given an additional pay or bonus of a few $1,000s to take on the additional duties of the assistant manager. So trying to make sure you know what you're looking for, and if you yourself have combined positions, how are you compensating that position, and then how will you identify that as comparable in other communities? Data collection is the next slide. This is the fun stuff where you start actually getting out there and pulling the data together. This is time-intensive work. So sources of data might include your online sources. So a lot of municipalities have their MOUs, their labor contracts, benefit summaries, maybe they publish their salary schedules. All of that might be online. So that might be an easy grab for some information. As I mentioned before, there might be some summary reports available from councils of government or associations that you could grab, again, with caution. And then there's direct contact with the other agencies through a survey, a request for job descriptions, contracts, benefit summaries, whatever it might be that you're looking for. The custom survey is probably the most effective because you can define what it is that you're looking for. You can summarize each of the positions that you're surveying and give people a chance to note how their position might be different than what you've described as your position. So these are areas where you're going to want to make sure you're making contact, you're identifying somebody in those comparable agencies that you can have a conversation with and email communications back and forth to make sure that you're getting the information. I'll also say that this is an area where things get slowed down a lot of times because there's so much effort involved in getting this. And as you know, people are busy. It's hard to get information sometimes. So this is the area where it can take weeks or months to actually collect the information. And you got to have somebody on it full time. Because of this, we acknowledge that doing this work is very labor intensive, requires a lot of effort on staff. And that's why a lot of people will hire somebody else to do the work for them because it's just so involved and there's some technicalities that you want to deal with, especially if you're facing potential arbitration. So we just want to do a quick survey on a question related to how you gather this information. So if you could just take a minute to respond to the survey here, it's pretty straightforward. How are you collecting information, or how have you done this historically? Do you do it internally? Or do you hire somebody? We'll just wait for people to respond to that. I will say that I've seen it both over time. There are agencies that are quite accomplished at doing this themselves and pride themselves on doing the work well. And there are others who just want to make sure that they are not culpable or seen as putting any pressure on the scale as the data is collected and presented.
Great. And Kristen, did you launch the poll?
I can't see if it's been launched.
Sorry, technical difficulty. Give me just a
What's a webinar without technical difficulty, right?
It's the world we live in.
That's right.
Nope, I see it now.
So there it is. Just a quick select one answer, and if you haven't done one, what would be the approach that you might consider undertaking? I guess is the other way to look at that.
So John, I think while we
Yep.
let everyone respond to the poll, we can move on and we can
I
revisit
will.
that result.
Absolutely. So I mentioned data cleanup earlier, and this is besides data collection, data cleanup is the area that takes the most amount of effort. So here what we're trying to do is make sure all the responses that we received are actually comparable and accurate. So trying to make sure that we've got correct information is important. So we've got some results there on the survey. You're seeing that about 60% of respondents are doing the work internally. So that's a little higher than I would have thought, but it's good to know that people are out there actually doing the work. And I'm sure if you are, you can understand some of the things that we're discussing today in terms of the challenges that you face. I wanted to also just talk about the data cleanup in terms of making sure that you've got reliable information that you can back up. If you're facing arbitration, there's always the potential risk that you will be challenged in that. So some of the things that you're going to be looking at is, are the positions comparable? And that's, again, going back to, it's just the title that they're looking at, or did the respondents actually look at the job duties and responsibilities to make sure that they're comparing? Some of this starts to become very clear when you start compiling all the data and you get it together and you see that there are several outliers in the information. That's often a red flag that they might not be using the same comparable in terms of the position duties. So that's one question to follow up with is, let's talk about this position. You listed 40,000 and the rest of the market's coming back at 65,000. Why is yours different? And making sure that, you might get to the end of the conversation and say, yep, that's actually a comparable position and we're going to use that 40,000. More likely, you're going to get to the end of that and say, no, there is a difference in those positions and not use it. There are other things that you want to equalize, like base hours. If you're reporting information on an annual basis, you want to ask the question of how many hours is their base rate based on? Is it 35, 37 and a half, 40? And then you have to make the intentional decision whether you're going to equalize those. I'll bring them all to the same number of hours that you are employing for your positions. If you have part-time or full-time positions, you want to make sure, again, you're comparing to other like positions. Scope is important, but if it's a part-time position, it might not have the same responsibilities as a full-time position. The hourly rate might be slightly different as well. So asking questions to follow up and make sure that's clear is important. You also want to look at the tiers. And again, that was mentioned earlier in the first presentation. So many communities are now offering benefits at different tiers and even pay scales at different tiers based on the timing that somebody was hired. So I've dealt with communities that have up to 5 tiers in their contracts, and we have to be careful as we're looking at the data, especially on the benefit side. Is the information that's being reported from the most accurate tier that's comparable to yours? So if you have 2 tiers yourself, and all new hires are based on a particular tier that offers a slightly lower benefit, you would want to make sure that you're looking at the same tier in other communities for most recent hires. Sometimes you get information reported to you that's an average of tiers. Sometimes you get information that's reported as the tier that the person who's responding happened to be in when they were hired, or the one that they're most familiar with. So circle back around, make sure that you know which tier is being compared. I have also listed all of the tiers in some responses so that the client can actually see what has happened historically over time and how things have changed. That's especially helpful if it's a community that hasn't yet adopted any new tiers. They might start to see how people go about implementing benefit changes through multiple tiers. So that's a benefit there. Another thing we find sometimes is people report information from contracts that are expired. To them, it's just par course for the business. The contract expired 2 years ago, so this is what we're paying. If that is the case, you want to make sure that you report that in your findings so that anybody looking at it knows that this is information that is 2 years old. You might decide to eliminate that. You might decide to put a footnote on it, or you might just simply ask, if you're getting close to the end of negotiations, do you have a sense, are you looking at a 3% or 4% increase over this number, and then apply that, and again, make a note that that's an assumption, so that you're actually providing the most accurate information. And I'll say it again, if you're risking possible arbitration or legal challenge on the work that you're doing, make sure you document everything and be as precise as you can in your data sources so that you can always go back and justify the information that you have. One other thing that comes up on this part of the study is, when is the next increase going to happen? If you happen to be surveying 2 weeks before half of your benchmarks are about to increase their pay, they might be reporting the new pay rate, they might be reporting the current pay rate. So it's important to go back and ask that question and understand. It's also helpful to just ask the question outright. Do you know what your next pay raise will be percentage-wise? And that would help give the decision makers in your community a little bit of information about where the trends are. And if you're in negotiations, that would also help the unions to see what's happening in other communities as well. I wanted to point out, I didn't say earlier that as far as the number of comparables, when you're looking at selecting your benchmarks, 5 is the minimum, and I hesitate to go more than 12. And it's just because the data can be overwhelming. So it's important to get the right mix. 5 is kind of low, especially if you get only a 50% or 80% response rate, then you might only have 4 comparables. So make sure that you're getting sufficient data to make a justifiable recommendation based on that. And go to the next slide. Finally, it's pulling it all together and presenting it. You could have different audiences. So how much information, the detail of the information, the way that information is presented will vary based on your audience. So if you're in negotiations, you obviously want to bring in the information that's going to provide a sound basis so that both parties can see what's included and some backup documentation to support what you found. If you're presenting to your city council, that might be more summary information, whereas if you're presenting to a compensation board, you might have to get into the weeds on that and provide them with a lot of information. So think about who your audience is and how much information you're providing so that you can communicate most effectively with those individuals who need to hear the information at that time. Looking at the actual form of the presentation, summary charts and tables are much easier to understand than pages and pages of text. I'm sure we all know that. So trying to make sure that your data is graphically and visually appealing and people can look at it and get the answer that they need right away without asking a lot of questions or raising doubt about anything. So spend some time thinking about how you're going to present the information so that it is understandable. And then finally, also, is it defensible? Again, going back to the arbitration question or a legal challenge, do you have all the documentation there in terms of where you collected the data, when you collected it, the expiration dates of the contracts, who you talked to in the other communities? That all becomes very important. You might also want to keep track of the data that you decided based on your analysis to not include in the final numbers. Because somebody might say, well, I know that that community next door has a similar position, but you'd want to be able to pull up your notes and say, well, we did look at that and find out that it is actually not comparable. They're changing the position, and it is no longer the same duties, even though the title has remained the same. So making sure you have all that backup information is always critical. And then how often are you going to update this information? Keeping a template helps, so that, again, you can be consistent. And that was pointed out in the last presentation. You don't want to be changing year over year about how the information is presented and who you're using as your benchmarks. Consistency pays big dividends. So having that information readily available will do a lot to simplify things in the future and demonstrate some sense that you are on top of things. So with that, I will hand it over to Nitish.
Thank you, John. So my in my couple of slides, my opportunity here is to share with you as a chief labor negotiator. I use GovInvest products, but also was able to use the results. For example, as John mentioned, the data, and we hired outside vendor consultant to do a comparator agency for us when I was at the special district, and some of the challenges and basically the pain points that I discovered, and also how I was able to use that and really create opportunities for the district and address some of the major challenges for the district. Let me start off by talking about a little bit on what's on this slide. As John mentioned, that it's really important to make sure that you have the right number of comparator agencies, but also what's happening with the coronavirus really changed the workforce environment. What's happening is that employees are flexible to move from agency to agency, even move from one major city to another, or one part of the state to another part of the state. Employees are looking for flexibility. Employees are looking for other types of compensation that is really balances with their lifestyle, and also ensures that they have some flexibility. So what you see here is that recently, this was a study that I was part of, and we actually looked at about 80 positions and studied the comparator agencies. We also looked at the agencies that we are regionally very close to, but also agencies that are similar in size and scope, but maybe about this agency I was looking for was in Sacramento region, but we also looked at San Francisco region and also Los Angeles region, and our scope was that we want to compare the right size agency. And what we did is that we adjusted the data to for geographical differences to really see how much is our compensation in terms of employee compensation. How are they, how are they fairly represented with other agencies? If you look at this, the bar chart here, you'll see that only 7 positions there are over 5% or over, which is what the board's value or goal was, that we want to make sure that we pay our employees at the 55th percentile. But the rest of the positions, about almost 75 positions, you could see that a number of positions, 15 of them were heavily undercompensated, and then about a number of them were basically undercompensated. So what are the opportunities for us as a district I was serving, is that how can we turn this the bar charts that's in red into more favorable, and also address some of the issues the agency was facing. So next slide. So one of the challenges, as I mentioned, that we did a comparator agency, And each year, last few years we did it, we get a report, and then basically we can only use the report one time. I was having a hard time is like having some kind of database or a system where this, once you do a comparator agency, and as John mentioned, that are you building that off that the base data, and are you able to use that data and update it in a timely and efficient manner? Most of us on this call, we know this, that it takes a long time to get the classification and compensation study done, to get the data, the results, and it takes about 6 months, sometimes up to 9 months, and then it really it puts a lot of stress on employees, and then also on the organizations, because by the time this data is compiled and the salaries adjusted, employees have already left the system or the agency, or there has been missed opportunities. So really one of the major challenges that I experienced was having a system and not having a system that really tracks it. So one of the opportunities that later on, as you'll hear from Jasmine, she'll present, is that a system-driven approach where you can build off that each year and update the data as timely and as in an efficient manner. One of the things that we did is that, as you saw in the previous slide, a number of employees were heavily undercompensated. So we really looked at the geographical differences and put together a compensation plan. Instead of looking at a compensation plan from a single source, we looked at more of a grouping by employee pay band or employee by group, and really looked at the similar kind positions, like all the supervisors in one group, directors in one group, and really wanted to see how far they are off or from each other in terms of the comparator agencies. And the opportunity that we're creating is the earnings potential, as one of the challenges that we were having is the different retirement systems and different tiers of benefits. When the study was done for us, we were not able to look at those ad pays or the different retirement system. Only thing we compared was top step. So that was really a missed opportunity, and on our part, because what we realized later on that organizations are creating other incentives to incentivize recruitment, and also incentivize retirement. For example, are we going to do a one-time, pensionable increase to a classic employee, which is basically the employee group that has the highest level of benefits? And then are we going to take that savings if the employee retires, and then take the savings into the next tier employees who have modified retirement, or retirement that is less lucrative? So really taking the opportunity to see how can we take the savings from the different bargaining groups or different employee tiers, and really compensate in the areas that is heavily in need. One of the things that we experience, especially with younger generation or younger workforce, was that they were more concerned about the amount of money that's in their pocket. They did not look at too much into the benefits, for example, health benefits or retirement benefits, but really what is in my pocket. So we looked at for opportunities to create that for them as well. As many of you have probably experienced, it's right now in this government industry primarily is recruitment, and then also retention is a big challenge. So as you know, that when somebody leaves your organization to go to another organization, it really creates the gap, but also the current employees, they pick up that job, and then creates the organization has a hard time catching up to basically being fully staffed, and then also be able to ensure that employees have the right amount of work that's been assigned to them. So those are the challenges that we experience, and I really was fortunate to use some of the tools, for example, the labor costing tool that was in the previous presentation, and look at that, and then also look at the data from the compensation, and put together a compensation plan that addressed a number of these issues that I described. So later on, you'll see some of the things that I was talking about in the in Jasmine's presentation, but really taking the global approach of the to compensation and ensure that as an agency, are we setting the right type of compensation benefits to ensure that our employees and future employees make us as an employer of choice. So that is my presentation. Next slide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nitish. And we have one more poll question, another survey question here. So we'll go ahead and launch the poll. The question is, how often do you review compensation data? More than once a year, every few years? Great. And as that results are coming up, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my portion of the presentation here. All right, so the results have come up. It looks like more than once a year, 18%, once a year, 18%, and every few years, 63%. That's super interesting. I'll take a snapshot of that for myself for later. Wonderful. Just want to confirm everyone can still see my screen. And what I'm going to be presenting is really tying everything that we've talked about today together. So not only looking at the compensation benchmarking, but also what we started off with, discussing labor costing. I know this is a national audience, and in some cases, negotiations is not relevant, but the basic two main use cases are being able to do essentially position budgeting. So looking at every single one of your employees, all the costs, projecting them out into the future. And then also, if you do have labor negotiations, being able to do labor costing for those negotiations. And the way we sort of look at this is the labor costing module is all about having your information in one place. So looking at all of that data. So on the left side of the screen, basically what we have, and this is just a pretend place that I made up, Baymont County here, but it has all the different benefits that you might be looking at. So for example, salary increases, longevity pay, on-call pay, overtime, shift differentials, any kind of medical benefits, any kind of pension costs that you have, and then any kind of special pays. So we know this is just one example. Every single one of your organizations is unique. And so the system is set up to be able to handle that. And we currently work with over 1,000 government agencies. So we've really seen the whole universe of all the different types of benefits. And so the idea is that you can do any adjustments on that sidebar. And on the right side of the screen, you'll be able to see some really interesting metrics that'll help you get a sense of what are my labor costs? So the first one here is the annual cost of labor. So the red line is if you were to take your existing contracts, like your existing situation, and just project it out 5 years. Typically, there's some slight increases due to step increases or other built-in increases. And the blue line is a scenario that I ran that before this year would have been a very typical scenario, like looking at what happens if we just increase salaries by about 3% a year. So what we can do is we can actually go into the sidebar and maybe, for example, this year, you're going into some of those conversations. We were talking about how inflation's been really, really high. Maybe there's an ask for 11% salary increase this year. In 23, and then maybe it's like things sort of normalize and there's a 6 the year after and then a 4 the year after that. This is just, totally made up. That's one example. You can plug any numbers you want in there. The idea is that once you enter that in, it immediately recalculates the annual cost, and you can go ahead and save that as a new proposal. So I'm just going to name the proposal with today's date. And, as you go through those conversations, you might have several different proposals that are being discussed. So being able to pull up any kind of different situations that you're thinking about and being able to see how they compare, financially, does it make sense? How are you going to get to the middle, to somewhere where the agency can really afford, the package that's being discussed? For this example, we'll just kind of stick with the original scenario. And what you'll be able to see is, okay, well, not only do I want to see the annual cost, I also want to know the cumulative cost, the total cost over this 5-year period. And so it's calculating to show that over the 5-year period, there's a $2.52 million total cost increase. That's typically information that councils, city managers, other people who are, more at a more high level trying to understand. The system does all of the calculations of the roll-up costs. So as was previously discussed in the first presentation, when you're increasing, salaries, there's not only an increase to just the salary, there's also the increase to other pays that are tied to salary. So other pays, you can see that's increasing, overtime is increasing. Here is the salary increase itself. So really being able to get specific about really what is the impact of some of these decisions and how is it going to affect you. And then finally, just kind of get into a little bit more detail here. Sometimes you might want to look at these individual pieces of compensation. So for example, I'm just looking at what was the impact of just the salary increase. And that's showing me here on the screen. I'm just isolating that piece of it. Maybe I just want to look at dental. Well, there's no changes to dental based on what that scenario. Or maybe I want to look at longevity. How's longevity going to be affected? So the idea is just that we can get super specific onto that, individual kind of cost element. And the other really great thing is because we're uploading all your individual employee information, you can start to build in a lot of interesting demographic views. So for example, right now I'm just looking at the entire organization, but if you wanted to break it down by position, you could pull it in that way, by union, if you have unions, vacant versus fill. This is important because you may have some vacancies and you want to be able to kind of account for that. And ultimately, if you're going through this whole process, let's just say you start off with the labor negotiation, you find, get to the middle, you find a package that works for everybody. Then you can then translate this directly to your budget because we tie all the different accounting codes and IDs and funding sources to every single employee and these different categories. So you can literally just export this directly to your budget. So there's a lot of really great detail. I know that we don't have enough time today to get into all of it, but if you have more questions, we're happy to set up individual time. I do want to show you just one more aspect of this that I think is really interesting and helpful. So as you're going through these different conversations, you might have things that come up that you just didn't anticipate. And so we really have the ability to add in any kind of special pays that are coming up. And since gas is so expensive right now, I'm putting in a gas stipend. And I'm going to put that into the special pay category. And this is where you can get very specific. Is this a flat dollar per person? Is it a percentage of pay? Is it an aggregate dollar amount where for some benefits like overtime, you may not be able to predict what an individual is going to do in overtime in the future, but you might know for the entire group what people have done in the past. So being able to put an amount for an entire group is an option. But for something like this, we're going to make it a flat dollar. And then you can also type in an eligibility rule. And that just means that you can get specific about who's going to get this benefit. Maybe, so basically it's like you can get specific about exactly who's going to get it. So if they have the right eligibility value, they'll receive it. And ultimately, once you hit save, just shows you how easy it is to add this into the workspace so that you can just start to do your costing immediately, looking at this gas stipend right here. So that's just one example of kind of how we add in that specific benefit. But in terms of how this all ties together, oftentimes when you're having these discussions, what happens next is there are questions about, well, how do we compare to other organizations? And so I will really happy to announce that we are building this compensation benchmarking module. I'll sort of transition to the way that we're approaching that as that specific use case, which is very exciting. There's sort of a couple things that John sort of mentioned this earlier. Well, we sit down with the client, we understand, there are different workflows. Sometimes you have a set list of comparators. In that case, we can just work with you and just say, okay, send us the 10, that you are always comparing to, that you want to compare to. We'll set this up so you can start to see all the different analysis. And then the other kind of workflow that I'm personally really excited about, it really involves artificial intelligence, machine learning, and basically what that all means is we're building a comprehensive compensation database across the country where you're going to be able to enter in your name of your organization, the number of comparators, and a specific job title or classification and years of service, and basically hit the submit button, and it'll run through this machine learning algorithm and just say, scanning through the whole database, all the different interesting tags that John mentioned earlier, what are the economic, structural, demographic factors that make other agencies truly comparable to yours. So of course, geography is going to be like a big piece of that, just looking like within a certain area. And then what will happen is it'll suggest this list of comparators, and you'll have the ability to say, well, we know, for example, and some of these just don't apply for whatever historical reasons, some institutional knowledge that, the system doesn't have, but you might have. And so you can just X out the ones that don't belong, hit submit. And once you have that list of comparators, what will happen on the right side of the screen is it'll do a ranking on total compensation. So it'll show you, in this example, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, so I used agencies that I knew from around there, but maybe I'm Belmont and I'm number 5 on the list and I want to be competitive with Burlingame. And I want to be number 3 on this list. So what you can do is then open up the labor costing software that I just showed you and go through some scenarios and say, okay, what do we need to do to be more competitive? Do we need to increase salaries? Do we need to increase some of the other pays and special benefits? And you can run through all the different scenarios to really just understand, okay, what is it that I need to do to be where I want to be? And then we also include other information that you typically find like in a compensation study where it's showing you how you compare, your base salaries are above or below the market median, total compensation is above or below the market median. And the visuals are always just there to show you, like, visually for the years of data that we have, like what does that ranking look like? And the really exciting thing is, just like I showed on the labor costing side, where we could go into that specific cost element or specific benefit, you'll be able to drill down and say, okay, maybe I just want to look at pensions, and pensions in some places, there's some cost sharing. What does that look like? Maybe there's an employee pickup of the employer contribution or vice versa. You might want to look at longevity, and specifically across these other organizations, how does longevity work? How do these COLAs work? So really getting specific into those individual pieces of compensation. And then being able to see other really great visualizations as well, such as this position versus experience comparison, where on the bottom we have years of service, and on the left we have compensation. So it's showing, like, at 5 years of service, here's the spread of compensation across all these different agencies, and here's the average, and here's where I fall within that. And that's just looking at base wages. Maybe we want to look at total comp or other wages or other benefits. So you can click in and be able to get more specific. And one of the things that we're also doing that's very exciting is using this artificial intelligence, machine learning on the job descriptions specifically. So like John mentioned, you might have an accountant at one agency that's doing the same work as an accounting manager at another agency. Being able to actually look at the job duties and the job responsibilities and making sure those are truly comparable, that is a part of this workflow as well, where we're collecting all the job descriptions. We're teaching the algorithm to say, okay, are these the same or not? We'll suggest them to you. We'll explain why, why were they selected? And you'll also always be able to link back to the original data set. So if you are in an arbitration or you need to be able to kind of back up what you've presented, we have our team of consultants who are here to obviously really help you with that. But at the same time, you'll always have the source of data as well. So yeah, that's pretty much the high level. I wanted to just give a quick introduction of the different tools that are available. We are very excited about this compensation benchmarking solution, because we know that just speaking with clients and, the poll that we did earlier, people are really, they're either spending tons of hours going and collecting that data, making calls, and it's just so much effort. So we really just want to take this task off your plate. If we can help in any way, we would really be happy to do so. And yeah, I just want to open it up for any questions that you might have at this time.
And Jasmine, while people are thinking about questions, one thing that you raised that I forgot to mention is, as you're going through the benchmarking process, or even just looking at your rates internally, your costs, I have a lot of clients who know where they want to be in the market. Like you noted in your example there, maybe you're in 5th, but you want to be in 3rd. I'm working with a couple of communities right now where one of them wants to kind of be right in the middle. That's kind of like what Nitish said, 55%, we're happy there. I've got one that wants to be 110%. They realize that they are a unique community with a lot of demands. Their service area is larger than most, so they know they have to have a higher package to offer. So they're intentional about being that 1.10, 1.1, 1.2 multiplier over the average. So that's really what they're looking for.
That's super helpful context, John. Thank you. All right, well, not seeing a ton of questions come through at this time. Oh, here's one right here. All right, let's see. The question is, the data within the compensation modules, are these for cities that are clients of GovInvest? So the answer to that question is we are actually not limiting this data set to only current clients, because we understand that we don't have every single agency as a client. And sometimes, might be working with one that has a list that are non-clients. And so what we're doing is actually sitting down with you. We'll understand, who is your list of comparators that you really want to compare to. And we will make an effort to go and collect that data. So we have a team of analysts who their whole job is to go and look at those MOUs online or look at the benefits, make those phone calls, and really just do that data collection work on your behalf. It does help if we do have clients that are already on the system because they've already put a lot of that data into the labor costing module. However, that's more of like an individual conversation if they're interested in kind of sharing that data.